December 20th, 1943, over Bremen, Germany. At 27,000 feet, the sky is a hard, thin blue and so cold that breath cracks in the mask and metal shrieks in the wind. The bomber stream stretches like a ragged silver river. Boeing B-17, flying fortresses, wingtip to wingtip, each one a freight of men, ammunition, and faith. Below, the industrial sprawl of Bremen breathes smoke and flame. Above, the air smells metallic and bitter from cordite and burning fabric. You can hear engines, always engines, the relentless four-engine thrum that is both cradle and coffin for the men who fly these machines. Near the front of a combat box, an exposed, dangerous place nicknamed Purple Heart Corner, ye Olde Pub blossoms pieces. Her skin has been chewed open by cannon and shell. The nose cone is gone. The forward plexiglass hangs like a wound. One propeller windmills uselessly. Another staggers, coughing black smoke. The electrical system has gone dark in places. The radio is dead. The intercom is a rumor. Inside, the crew move like men underwater, bodies bruised, fingers clumsy with cold, faces white with frozen sweat and shock. The ball turret is a frozen sphere of metal. The gunner's mechanisms have jammed in the bitter altitude and loss of power. Morphine syrettes are frozen and unusable. Every breath tastes like distant fires and the metallic tang of adrenaline. At the controls is 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Charles L. Charlie Brown, a farm boy from Weston, West Virginia, who has been a pilot a few short months and an aircraft commander only since takeoff that morning from RAF Kimbolton. Beside him is his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Spencer Pinky Luke, hands white on the yoke as they wrestle a crippled flying fortress back toward England. They have already lost too much. Half a rudder, part of the port elevator, the nose plexiglass blown away. The tail gunner, Technical Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, lies where a shell put him, killed. The tail cone has been shredded. A cannon shell passed through the fuselage and took a man's life. Men who can still move, keep moving, patching, propping again. The navigator, bombardier, radio operator, waist gunners, each face a map of frozen fear. The mission that morning was simple and brutal in equal measure. Strike the Focke-Wulf works in Bremen. The briefing had warned of hundreds of fighters and hundreds more flak guns. The bomber stream had been split into three elements. Ye Olde Pub's squadron slid into its assigned box on the edge, the place the Germans loved to tear into. It was Charlie Brown's first mission as an aircraft commander. He had moved up to the front when a damaged ship turned back. That small shift would make 1,000 small differences. Below the formation, the first curtains of flak bloom as black flowers, then orange, then gray. The B-17s hold their course. Then the fighters come, sleek, single-seat Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, leaping out of cloud and into the smoke. One after another, the fortresses take the blows, engines hit, gun turrets silenced, streamers of fabric trailing like ragged banners. The men inside the planes are part surgeon, part woodworker, part priest, stitching, bracing, praying. On the German side of that sky sits a different story. A Messerschmitt Bf 109G6, its mottled fuselage patched with quick gray paint, engine singing with the thin, high-pitched whine of the Daimler-Benz motor. At the stick is Franz Stigler, an experienced fighter pilot with Jägerschwader 27. He has flown dozens of sorties, fought Russians and British, felt the cold taste of victory and the sharper chill of loss. He is not a man untouched by the politics of his time. He knows the rhetoric, the goals, the patrols, but today he is a pilot, eyes trained for silhouettes and glints of oil and metal. When Stigler sees the crippled fortress, at first it is a predator's sighting, a four-engine bomber, trailing oil, faltering, an easy tally to be had. He remembers the way a Jägerschwader makes its claims. You press the attack, you close, you press the trigger. In the logbooks and on the wall at home, A bomber claim is a medal waiting. Earlier that day he already has accounted for 2 B-17s. One more, and he edges toward a decoration that in Nazi Germany carries more than honor. The incentives, decorations, status are real. The order of the day demands ruthlessness. He closes, diving down into the torn sky. The WWII's nose a precise spear against the wind. The fortress is a mangled human thing, not just aircraft, but a cathedral of men arranged inside, suffering. As Stigler slips into a firing position to finish what the battle has begun, something in the sight up ahead stops him. Through the jagged holes in the B-17's fuselage, he sees faces. Not empty cockpits, not smoke and wiring, but men. A hand trying to hold a wound closed, a pilot leaning forward weakly, eyes unfocused, another man dragging a shivering body away from the tail with the stubbornness of someone whose job is simply to survive the next minute. He sees the tail gunner, motionless, half-blooded and still. He sees blood and frost. He sees the reality of what a finished run would mean, not an abstract tally, but fire and shredded flesh. Parachutes that might never open in the cold, or might float down to a field where farmers would find them and bury them. All the training and the orders and the language of war, the easy directives, begin to look thin. Stigler thinks of the words his commander Gustav Rödel had once barked in anger. "If I hear of one of you shooting a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." That line, scrawled in the memory of a man who has seen men fall and bail in betrayals of codes older than nations, takes on a different weight. For a second, there is nothing but the clatter of the Messerschmitt's machine guns in his ears. Then the guns fall silent in his hands. He banks off slightly, closing the distance but not to strike. He moves into the bomber's blind spot and keeps formation instead. Close enough that the B-17's gunners can see him, close enough that the silhouette of a Messerschmitt on the port side will tell the German guns below not to fire. On the bomber's side, the wounded plane's crew do not at once read his intent. Charlie Brown, circling damaged and exhausted, is too busy with the aircraft to be sure whether the 109 is friend or foe. He sees the German pull alongside and instinct sharpens. He orders his top turret gunner to rake the fighter with a warning, to train the barrels, but not to fire. The message is blunt. Warn him off, but don't start a mutual slaughter. The turret gunners keep the crosshairs painted on the Messerschmitt, frozen as statues, because a single twitch could mean the difference between life and death for the men in Olde Pub. Stigler tries to communicate. He gestures with his hand. He pulls up and points toward the north, toward the open North Sea. He mouths the words as best he can. Land in Sweden, he seems to say, or at least head toward neutral territory. The bomber crew doesn't understand the German signals. There's no radio to speak of, and the damage has wiped away the possibilities for clear communication. The two aircraft move like animals in a strange truce, predator and prey, but with a mutual, fragile pause carved into the violence of the day. For a few minutes, long, impossible minutes, the sky holds its breath. The engines roar, the wind screams past, the men inside the fortress smoke and blood and cold. Below, flak gunners squint and see a Messerschmitt hugging the flank of an American heavy bomber. Recognition clicks in the heads of those gunners, and many hold their fire. For Stigler, the risk is enormous. To be seen in this act of mercy could be to be accused of treason. The Luftwaffe's rules are clear, harsh, and unforgiving. Yet he holds his place, shielding an enemy bird with the fragile armor of a single fighter and a pilot's conscience. Charlie Brown, hands cramped, ration of hope dwindling, keeps turning the B-17 toward the desperate safety of the English coast. Every degree of heading is a negotiation between damaged controls and the weight of wounded men, between engines that cough and the thought of friendly ground. He doesn't yet know the name of the man beside him in the gray sky. He doesn't yet know what that small, immediate mercy will cost or mean. He only knows to keep flying. The air between them is filled with contradictions. Charlie Brown stares through shattered glass at the Messerschmitt, holding tight to their flank. So close he can see the pilot's face beneath his canopy, the white scarf fluttering against his flight suit, goggles reflecting the sun like molten coins. Brown's mind runs through possibilities, a trick, a setup. Maybe the German is toying with them before finishing the kill, but the 109 doesn't fire. Instead, it moves slightly ahead, then falls back into position like an escort. "Jesus," the navigator, Al-Sadok, mutters through cracked lips. "What the hell is he doing?" No one answers. The intercom crackles with static and dying circuits. The engines groan like old men, coughing, trembling, losing power one after another. The B-17 limps along at a speed barely above stall, each gust of wind threatening to send it into a spin. Inside the Messerschmitt, Franz Stigler makes a decision that has nothing to do with tactics, training, or orders. He's thinking instead of his brother, August, another Luftwaffe pilot shot down earlier in the war by a bomber's defensive fire. He thinks of the sight of parachutes against a pale sky, of the emptiness left behind. He had sworn revenge back then, but not like this. Not on men who can no longer fight. He edges closer to the American bomber, reading the damage in detail now. The tail almost gone, the rear turret shredded and silent. Frost clings to jagged metal like white moss. One engine is feathered and dead, another coughs oily smoke. The elevator is barely hanging on, cables frayed, skin peeled back. Through the open nose section, he can see the bombardier, blood-soaked, still conscious enough to look up at him in disbelief. The B-17 is dying, yet it flies. Franz salutes. Just a small motion, 2 fingers to the brow beneath his canopy. A pilot's salute, not of sides, but of skill and survival. For a moment, the 2 aircraft are the only living things in a sky carved apart by war. Beneath them, the ruins of Bremen burn, smoke curling upward like the ghost of a civilization losing its mind. Brown's instinct is still to mistrust. He motions for the gunners to hold fire, though one of them, Sergeant Lloyd Jennings, can barely lift his arms. They wait. The Messerschmitt holds position, neither attacking nor retreating. Then suddenly, the German dips his wings and points toward the open sea, westward, toward England. Charlie Brown catches it. The signal, the gesture says it all. Go that way. Home. But the B-17 can't make Sweden. They can barely hold altitude. The compass is unreliable, and the engines are losing oil fast. Brown shakes his head, hoping somehow the German will understand that they're heading home to England, not neutral territory. Franz sees the movement, the refusal, and, with a grim acceptance, nods. He realizes what Brown intends. A straight shot across the German coast, over hundreds of miles of hostile territory, with half a plane left and no defense. It's suicide. Every flak battery and fighter squadron along the coast will tear them apart the moment they see the silhouette. Unless he positions his 109 directly beside the bomber, then slightly below its wing, so that from the ground it looks as though he's herding it. A wounded enemy forced down under escort. If German gunners think the B-17 is a captive, they won't fire. It's a dangerous illusion, one that could cost him his life if anyone interprets it as treason. But Franz Stigler doesn't flinch. The 2 aircraft move as one, over the outskirts of Bremen and toward the North Sea. Below, towns blur by. Delmenhorst, Oldenburg, tiny figures on the ground looking up, wondering why an American bomber is flying so close to a German fighter. At one flak battery, a gunner hesitates, hands on the trigger, uncertain whether to fire. His officer waves him off. The Messerschmitt is signaling control. This must be an escort. The guns remain silent. Inside Olde Pub, Charlie Brown can feel the vibration change. The flak has stopped. For the first time in hours, no one is shooting at them. He risks a glance left and meets Stigler's eyes, just for an instant, before the German looks forward again, scanning the sky like a guardian against his own side. The two planes reach the coastline. Ahead lies open water, the cold expanse between life and death. Here, Franz Stigler knows his protection must end. Beyond the coast, radar stations will track his 109, and Luftwaffe command will ask questions. A fighter seen escorting an enemy bomber. Even a whisper of such an act could mean a court-martial, or worse, execution for treason. He throttles back and moves alongside the bomber one last time. His gloved hand raises again. Not a salute this time, but a slow wave of farewell. Inside the B-17, Charlie Brown hesitates, then returns it. A weak, shaking gesture through the broken glass. For a second, both men hold each other's gaze. They are enemies by uniform, but in that frozen sky above the sea, they are simply men, each trying to survive the madness around them. Then Stigler breaks away. The Messerschmitt rolls right, dives gently, and disappears beneath a thin veil of cloud. The thunder of his engine fades until it's swallowed by the roar of the B-17's remaining motors. Charlie Brown exhales, a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for minutes. He turns back to the controls. "Let's get her home," he mutters. The crew stirs, half dead, half awake. Every man thinking of the same question, but too weak to ask. Why didn't he shoot? Ye Olde Pub limps on, engines screaming in protest. The left wing trembles like a wounded bird. Oil streaks trail into the grey sky behind her. Below, the North Sea stretches endless and cold, dotted with whitecaps like teeth. Hours later, England will rise on the horizon. Dark coastline, green fields, the ghostly outline of home. But that journey, too, will demand everything they have left. And as the bomber drifts out over the sea, alone again, Franz Stigler climbs back toward Germany, heart heavy. He hasn't just broken orders. He's broken faith with the machinery of war itself. But somewhere deep down, a quieter truth is beginning to form. That maybe mercy is not betrayal. Maybe it's the last act of honor a man can perform. The North Sea yawns below, gray and endless. The horizon tilts and wobbles as Charlie Brown fights the yoke, his hands numb, his vision tunneling. The cockpit smells of oil, blood, and smoke. Every vibration through the seat feels like the heartbeat of the dying plane itself. "Keep her level," co-pilot Spencer Luke murmurs, voice barely audible through the frozen oxygen mask. His face is pale, lips cracked. He's been fading in and out for the last 20 minutes, slipping toward unconsciousness. "I'm trying," Brown says through clenched teeth. His voice trembles not from fear, but from exhaustion. The fortress wants to fall apart. The rudder shudders with each gust of wind. One engine's gone. A second sputters. At any moment, the others could seize from lack of oil. Behind them, the remaining crew attending to the wounded as best they can. Sergeant Lloyd Jennings is wrapping a blood-soaked bandage around Sergeant Alex Yelisanko's leg, tying it off with a strip of parachute silk. The radio operator, Sergeant Dick Petchout, is half-conscious, his arm mangled. The waist gunner, Franz Frenchy Harloff, kneels beside him, whispering prayers he barely remembers. "Navigator," Brown calls out weakly. "What's our heading?" Al Sadok looks up from his chart, compass trembling in his gloved hand. "Still west, sir. I think we're over the sea now. If we keep this heading another 30 minutes, we should hit the English coast." "Assuming the engines last that long," mutters Yelisanko. The intercom hisses, then dies again. The B-17 feels heavier now, like gravity itself has decided to finish what the Germans started. Every second, the aircraft loses altitude, descending from 20,000 feet to 15, then 12. Brown adjusts the trim, forcing the wounded machine to hold altitude just above the icy wave. He glances out the shattered window. The left wing is riddled with holes, flaps hanging in tatters. The engine nacelles glisten with oil like black tears. But the sight of the open ocean brings something new to the crew. Silence. No flak, no fighters, no tracers. Just the raw, infinite quiet of survival. Minutes drag by. The fortress groans, protesting every mile. Then, faintly, mercifully, a thin strip of land appears through the haze. England. Charlie Brown lets out a breath that sounds like a sob. We made it. We damn well made it. The others barely react. Too tired. Too broken. But a murmur ripples through the fuselage, a whisper of disbelief that somehow, against every law of physics and chance, they're alive. As they near the coast, the airbase at Scything picks up a faint radar return. An unknown aircraft limping toward friendly territory. British fighters scramble, but when they catch sight of the incoming fortress, they hold their fire. The B-17's condition speaks for itself. RAF seething control to incoming fortress. You're trailing heavy smoke. Can you identify? The radio barely functions, but Brown manages to croak a reply through the static. This is Olde Pub. Returning from Bremen. Heavy damage. Requesting emergency landing. The controller's voice softens. Roger that, Pub. You're cleared to land. God help you, lad. You look like hell. Charlie lines her up with the runway. The landing gear indicator is out, so no one knows if the wheels are even down. The cockpit rattles violently as he brings the plane in low, fighting the crosswind. The engines are barely holding together. Brace, he shouts. The runway rushes up. Metal screams. Tires explode. The bomber hits hard, bounces once and skids across the field, leaving a trail of sparks and shredded metal before grinding to a stop in a cloud of steam. For a moment, there is nothing but the sound of wind whistling through torn metal. Then, one by one, the crew begin to stir. They've made it. Emergency crews race across the tarmac. Fire engines douse the smoking engines. Medics climb into the wreckage, shouting for survivors. They find them all, battered, frostbitten, but alive. Only one, the tail gunner Hugh Eckenrode, has been lost. Charlie Brown sits in the cockpit, too stunned to move. His hands are frozen to the controls. When the medics finally pry him free, he collapses onto the wing, staring up into the grey English sky. Somewhere up there, somewhere above those same clouds, a German pilot is flying home, haunted by the same silence. In the days that follow, Olde Pub becomes legend around the airfield. Mechanics can hardly believe it flew at all. Dozens of holes big enough to crawl through, over 100 smaller punctures, control cables hanging by threads. Not a single working turret left. It's a miracle wrapped in aluminum. When the debriefing officers ask how it happened, Brown gives them the facts. Flak over Bremen, fighter attack, heavy damage, near loss of the aircraft. But when he gets to the part about the Messerschmitt, the one that didn't shoot, the room falls silent. He didn't fire, the intelligence officer repeats, incredulous. No, Brown says. He escorted us, all the way out. The officer frowns, then shakes his head. You're lucky, Lieutenant, but don't talk about that outside this room. No one's going to believe you anyway. So Brown doesn't. Not for decades. In the silence of post-war years, the memory remains. The face behind the canopy, the salute, the mercy in a world that had forgotten what mercy was. And somewhere, deep in Germany, Franz Stigler also keeps his silence. Because to speak of that moment, to admit what he'd done, could still mean ruin. But both men remember, and neither forgets. The war dragged on for another 1.5 years after that December encounter, but for Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown, the world had already shifted. In the months following Bremen, Stigler continued to fly for the Luftwaffe. Not with joy, but with duty. The war had turned grimly defensive for Germany. Every day, More bombers filled the skies. More of his comrades vanished. He watched his country crumble beneath waves of fire and steel. He survived air raids, the collapse of his airfield, and the fall of Berlin. By April 1945, the Reich was little more than smoke and memory. When the surrender finally came, Stigler buried his flight logbook in a barn outside Munich, the same book that listed his victories, his sorties, and the names of those who had fallen. The entry for December 20th, 1943, had a blank line where another bomber kill might have been written. When American troops occupied Germany, Stigler was one of the lucky few. He wasn't a party zealot, he hadn't bombed civilians, and he had no stomach for the war crimes that had been revealed in its wake. Still, he carried the weight of his service and the secret of what he had done over Bremen. He fled to Canada in 1953, starting a quiet life as a mechanic in Vancouver. He worked with his hands, fixing engines, restoring small aircraft, always near planes, but never again in combat. The world had moved on, yet some nights he would look up at the roar of a distant jet and remember that battered B-17. Half a world away, Charlie Brown was trying to do the same. After the war, Brown stayed in the U.S. Army Air Forces, later the Air Force, and built a respectable career. But the memory of that day over Germany never left him. He had seen the worst of war, and then, in a single impossible moment, the best of humanity. Still, he said nothing. The incident wasn't in any report. No one wanted to hear a story about a compassionate German pilot. It didn't fit the narrative of good versus evil. So, like Stigler, he buried it deep under years of service, family, and the slow erosion of time. It wasn't until 1986, more than 40 years after the war, that the silence began to break. Charlie Brown, then retired and living in Florida, was invited to speak at a veterans' reunion. During his talk, he recounted the mission to Bremen, the flak, the damage, the dying crew. And then, cautiously, he told them about the German fighter who didn't shoot. When he finished, the room was silent. Then one man stood up and said, "Do you know who he was?" Brown shook his head. "No, I never learned his name." The man smiled. "Why don't you try to find him?" It was a simple suggestion, but something inside Charlie stirred. That old question, the one that had haunted him since 1943. Who was that man? Why did he spare us? So he started searching. He wrote letters to Luftwaffe veterans associations, German flying clubs, historical societies. He placed ads in newsletters and magazines describing the event. December 20th, 1943. A B-17 named Olde Pub damaged over Bremen, escorted by a German fighter who did not fire. Weeks turned to months. Nothing. Then, in January 1990, a letter arrived from a man in Vancouver. It began simply, "Dear Mr. Brown, I am the one who spared your life that day." Brown read it twice before he believed it. The letter was from Franz Stigler. When they finally spoke by phone, Stigler's voice was gentle, precise, tinged with a faint Bavarian accent. He confirmed every detail. The damage to the B-17, the missing tail, the faces inside, the salute. "I could see you were in trouble," Stigler said. "You were like a wounded bird, trying to get home. I could not shoot." Brown, sitting alone in his living room, felt tears well in his eyes. He had imagined this conversation 1,000 times, but never believed it would come. When they finally met in person later that year in Vancouver, it was like watching two halves of the same memory join at last. They met at the airport, fittingly under the shadow of a restored B-17 on display. Brown, white-haired and still tall, wore a bomber jacket patched with the 379th Bomb Group insignia. Stigler, a bit smaller, wore a blazer with a small Luftwaffe pilot's badge pinned discreetly to the lapel. They walked toward each other, hesitant at first. Then, without a word, They embraced. Witnesses said they wept openly, two old men bound not by war, but by a single act of mercy that had outlived everything else. Over the next years, they became as close as brothers. They visited each other's homes, attended air shows together, told their story at schools and veterans' events. Each time, audiences listened in stunned silence as the two men, once mortal enemies, stood side by side, telling of a day when compassion triumphed over hatred. "I didn't think I'd ever see him again," Brown would say. "But God wanted me to." And Stigler would always reply softly, "I could not have shot you. You were not my enemy that day." The story spread slowly at first, then around the world, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hour, light still found its way through. But time, relentless as ever, continued to march on. By 2008, both men were in their 80s. They called each other often, sometimes daily. When one became ill, the other would call just to talk about flying, about faith, about how strange and beautiful life had been since that December morning over Bremen. They died within months of each other. Franz Stigler in March 2008, Charlie Brown later that year in November. When news of their passing reached the aviation community, tributes poured in. Pilots and historians called it one of the greatest acts of chivalry in modern warfare. But perhaps the most fitting words came from Brown himself, written years earlier. "Franz was the story I never told, because no one would have believed it. But I believe God gave me that moment to see that even in war, humanity still lives." There's a silence that follows every war, the kind filled not with peace, but with echoes. For Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown, their story didn't end in the sky over Bremen, or even in the reunion that followed half a century later. It lived on in the way people spoke of it afterward. As a lesson, a parable, a reminder that the line between enemy and brother can dissolve in the span of a heartbeat. In 2008, when both men passed away, aviation historians began calling their encounter the Christmas Truce of the Air. Newspapers across Europe and North America ran their story under headlines that sounded like myth. Enemy pilot saves B-17, mercy in the skies over Germany, the gentleman's duel that never happened. But it wasn't myth. It was meticulously documented through logs, photos, and the testimonies of both men. A moral act so rare, so out of place amid total war, that it almost felt supernatural. And yet, if you asked either of them, they would have said it was simple. Franz would tell school children, "You fight for your country, yes, but never forget you are a man first. There is a difference between killing and murder." Charlie would nod beside him, adding quietly, "He had every right to shoot, but he saw us as human beings, and that changed my life." They told their story to anyone who would listen. Veterans, students, historians, even pilots of modern jet fighters who'd grown up hearing the legend and could hardly believe it was true. At one air show, a young pilot approached Franz, saluted, and said, "Sir, I hope if I'm ever in your position, I'll have the courage to do what you did." Stigler smiled sadly and replied, "I hope you'll never have to make that choice." In the years after their deaths, their friendship became the subject of books, documentaries, and lectures. One of the most notable was A Higher Call by Adam Marcos, a title borrowed from something Franz once said to Charlie. "No one would have known if I had shot you down, but I would have known, and I could not live with that. You follow the rules of war, but there is a higher call, the call of humanity." That idea, a higher call, became the heart of their legacy. Because for all the grand strategies and military might of World War II, it was still fought by ordinary men. Men capable of cruelty, yes, but also of compassion, even in the face of unimaginable loss. Imagine that sky again. December 20th, 1943, the cold wind screaming over Bremen. A bomber ripped open, a fighter diving in for the kill, and then not killing. It's easy to forget, amid the statistics of war, that moments like that existed at all, that amid millions of deaths, one man's decision not to pull a trigger could ripple outward for generations. If Stigler had fired that day, Olde Pub would have fallen into the fields below, another forgotten wreck among thousands. Brown and his crew would never have come home. Their families would have received letters beginning with, "We regret to inform you," and Franz Stigler would have earned another victory mark on his tail, one more notch in a war already drowning in them. But because he didn't, history gained something else, a story that transcended it. In the decades since, both men's families have continued to meet. They exchange letters, share photographs, and gather at airfields under the wings of restored bombers and fighters. Machines that once carried their fathers to war and, against all odds, to friendship. Charlie Brown's daughter once said at a memorial, "When I look at Franz's face in old photos, I don't see my father's enemy. I see the man who gave me my father." And perhaps that's the truest legacy of all, because wars end when men stop fighting, but peace begins when they start remembering each other's humanity. In a museum in Washington, D.C., there hangs a photograph of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler standing side by side, smiling beneath the shadow of a B-17. Beneath it, a small plaque reads, "A moment of mercy in a time of madness, proof that even in war, honor can prevail." And if you listen closely, in that quiet gallery, among the engines and medals and names of the fallen, you can almost hear the echo of two planes high above the clouds, flying side by side across the frozen sky, not as enemies, but as men.